Good evening, everyone, and thank you. Welcome to the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University. I am Mark Rozelle, and I have the honor to serve as the Dean of the Schar School. And we are very proud to host the Michael V. Hayden Center for the past now 6 years. And I know many of you are Hayden Center regulars who attend for these high-quality forums that we present. And in an era of hyper-partisan politics, we all know that there is a need for forums such as these that provide informed analysis of the challenging issues of our time. We are nonpartisan, non-ideological. We care about good government, good public policy, wherever it comes from, regardless of party or ideology. And the focus here is on the very complex issues of intelligence and security. Over the course of any academic year, we have major policymakers, directors of federal agencies, leading analysts, leading our forums one after another. And tonight is special in that you, the audience, your questions will drive the discussion of our distinguished panel. So it's great to see all of you here this evening, and I extend a welcome also to the many people who signed up for the virtual participation in this forum. They too will have the opportunity to ask questions of our panel. So thank you for attending, and I hope to see you at future events here. And I now welcome to the stage the director of the Hayden Center, Larry Pfeiffer. Are you going to do it from there? I'm going to do it from there. That's even better.
Yep.
All right, take it over.
Less wear and tear on the shoe leather. So thank you all for coming. Thanks to the virtual audience for joining us as well. As Mark mentioned, we're the Hayden Center, founded 6 years ago by General Michael Hayden here. And our desire is to put a spotlight on intelligence and the role it plays in supporting policymakers. We do that largely through these events, featuring prominent experts, and tonight featuring these prominent experts from the Hayden Center and the Schar School. If you want to know about our events first, join our mailing list. You can go to our website, haydencenter.gmu.edu. And on the right-hand side, there's a box. You put your email address in, hit return, and you'll be added to our list, and you'll be the first to hear about our upcoming events. Tonight's event, as just mentioned, is being live streamed on YouTube and being recorded. So if you don't want to be recorded, then don't get in front of a microphone and talk to us later. We are on social media. We are pretty prominent on Twitter. We have presence on LinkedIn and Facebook. Given the strange ways social media is going these days, we also are available on Threads, on Post.News, on Mastodon, and on Blue Sky. So follow us there and join in the conversation. We tend to not only announce and discuss our events, but we also post information and repost information that's of interest to those who follow the intelligence and national security field. I normally say there'll be time for questions at the end, towards the end of the event, but tonight there's going to be time for questions at the beginning of the event. What I would ask is, try to keep your questions as brief as reasonable. Please do keep them in the form of a question. Just having you lecture us doesn't necessarily move the program forward. Let us know who you are. We'd love to know who you are and what your affiliations might be. But if you want to be anonymous, that's okay too. If you are a journalist, and I'm not expecting many journalists, but if you are a journalist, we'd love you to let us know who you are so that we can keep tabs on all the great stuff you write or record. The virtual audience, you may want to ask questions as well. Please do that by using the live chat function on YouTube. We have one of our student interns is going to be monitoring that, and she's going to send me those questions on my trusty little smartphone here, where I will be squinting at them to read them as we move along through the questions. After the event, for those of you who are here in person, we've got a great reception afterwards over in the multipurpose room. Please join us. We got great food, we got great drinks, opportunity to network, opportunity to have some one-on-one conversations with our guests here. For those of you in the virtual world, if you're in the Washington metro area, next time come to the event in person. You can get some free food and free drinks. We've been doing events for 6 years now, hard to believe. And if there's one comment we get, is that we never leave enough time for questions. So last year we did this, and tonight we do it again. We turn it around, and we're going to let your questions drive the content. The focus tonight is U.S. national security challenges in 2024. Very broad subject, so shoehorn your question into that broad category, and we're fine. We've assembled a great group from the Hayden Center and Schar School that hopefully offers a wide enough range of experience and knowledge to address most, if not all, your questions. But we want to recognize up front that some of you may stump the chumps up here, and we'll do our best to soft shoe through some of your questions. In terms of our panel members, in the center of the room here, as mentioned before, and as many of you know and recognize, we have General Michael Hayden. General Hayden is a former director of both the Central Intelligence Agency and the National Security Agency. He was the first principal deputy director of national intelligence. He led U.S. Air Force intelligence at a time, and it had several other distinguished positions. He's the author of 2 books, one of which was published 8 years ago this week, called Playing to the Edge, which tells the story primarily of his time in intelligence, but it also provides some background on his life that led to intelligence as well. If you've not read it, I commend it to you. It's a fantastic book. And he's been a commentator on national security issues in the print press, on the television, on the radio, and on social media. So if you're not following General Hayden, you're missing out on some really pithy, fun comments at times. Secondly, to General Hayden's left is Andrew McCabe. Andy is a former acting director and deputy director at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He served there for 20 plus years, I believe, in many, many posts. You can take some time, go Google him, and you can read all about his career. Fascinating event. Or don't Google him. Maybe you'll also read some other crazy stuff, but that's okay. Currently, he serves as a senior national security and law enforcement analyst at CNN, so some of you may recognize him from television. He is the co-host of a fantastic podcast called Jack, a Special Counsel podcast. It looks at the special counsel cases against Donald Trump, as well as some of the other related cases that exist against President Trump, and they've even discussed some of the other classified documents cases that were investigations that were led against President Biden and Vice President Pence. And he is, last but not least, a distinguished visiting professor here at Schar School. So if you are not a student here, he's a good reason to come and be a student here. To my immediate left is Ellen Laipson. Ellen is the director of Schar School's International Security Graduate Program and the Center for Security Policy Studies. She had a 25-year career in the U.S. government that featured prominently her role as vice chair of the National Intelligence Council, the organization responsible for producing national-level estimates and analysis of the most important security issues for the president. She did that from 1997 to 2002. She served on President Obama's President's Intelligence Advisory Board, the Secretary of State's Foreign Affairs Policy Board. She joined the Schar School after a 13-year stint as CEO of the Stimson Center. Earlier in her career, she had positions at State Department, the National Security Council, and the Congressional Research Service. She served and has served on boards of several international security-related organizations. Last but not least, at the opposing end of the dais here, we have David Priess. David is a senior fellow here at the Hayden Center. He is currently the director of intelligence at Bedrock Learning. And I must admit, David, when I hear Bedrock, I immediately think Flintstones. And
that's it.
But I'm sure for those who want to know a little bit more, they're an enterprise software as a service social network for organizations across the public-private sector divide with global interests. They're a spin-off of War on the Rocks, for those of you who are familiar with that website and blog. Think LinkedIn and Netflix combined for lifelong learning. He, too, co-hosts a podcast for Lawfare. It's called Chatter. It talks about national security issues as well as some other very interesting and fun topics. Former CIA analyst and presidential daily briefer during the Clinton and Bush administrations. He's the author of The Book of Secrets, which is the definitive, unclassified examination of the daily briefing, intelligence briefing that the president gets. If you've not read it, again, another book I highly commend to you. He serves as a fellow here at the Hayden Center, and he has also been a visiting professor at the Schar School of Policy and Government. Whew, okay, that's a lot of introductions. What I'd like to do, as you all are cogitating on the questions you're going to ask, and as you begin to line up at these 2 microphones at the opposite sides of the room, and for those of you online, as you're frantically typing your questions in on the live chat of YouTube, I thought I would begin by turning to General Hayden, our center stage prominent expert, and ask you, in 2024, what do you consider the greatest national security challenge, greatest national security threat?
Okay, well, thank you. First of all, I have aphasia, so occasionally it's hard for me to say many things, but I want to say something. So 3 years ago, the CIA director called me. He was going to Congress for the first time, okay? And they said, so tell me about things. What will you think about that? And I said, well, it's China. Yeah, you were really China. And then we talked a little bit, and then I said, wait a minute. Did I say China again? Yes, okay, good, that's good. Okay, China. And then the third thing was China, okay? And that's what I would say for the maybe 2 years. But now, what's going on now? There's a war in the Middle East, a really bad war. And then in Kyiv, the same thing for 2 years. I'm glad I'm not there, okay, at CIA, because there's a lot going on, okay? There are 3 things, usually when I was there, and that's more than 10 years ago, it was bin Laden, okay? And that was it. I know I had to do something else, and I should have done more with China, but it's hard, it's very hard. But now, for the CIA director, it's 3 things, at least 3 things, okay? Boy, that's really hard for him and the government and the president as well. Now, I said 3 things. So what's number 1? Right now, it's Kyiv, okay? Because I'm worried about Kyiv. It's not going well for at least a half a year. So I'm worried, and if we don't do more for the United States and NATO, I don't know what will happen. So that's what I have to say.
That is quite a plate for our national security leaders to be focused on. And that doesn't even begin to address a handful of other topics that I think we all would agree require almost full-time attention. I would encourage you guys, if you got questions, to begin lining up at the microphones. Otherwise, it could become really quiet up here. So please start lining up or sending your questions in. While we're waiting for you to do that, let me toss this to Ellen and ask for your thoughts on what General Hayden just had to say and any additional thoughts you might have on national security threats.
Thanks, Larry. So I think General Hayden's list demonstrates that we are at a moment of quite extraordinary instability in the international system. Traditionally, we always said, the United States can handle one major conflict and maybe a small one, or two medium-sized conflicts, but we really have a system that is in turmoil and instability now. China-Taiwan, that we thought was the kind of front edge of the thing we should worry about the most, seems the less immediate, less acute than the 2 other examples that you gave. But I guess what I would just extrapolate from his list is the perception of American leadership. That's an added feature of a moment of kind of instability, so that other countries are now bringing out whether the United States has the capacity, the will, the interest in being the sort of manager of these international crises. Can we bring these crises to less violent, more can we manage them in a way that may give a chance for positive outcomes? And I think that ripple of uncertainty and anxiety among our major allies and our adversaries about the nature of American leadership adds to the acuteness of the list that he has described. Yeah.
Just to touch on General Hayden's topic, and I'll point this one towards you, Andy, is China as a threat. You have this strong FBI, Department of Justice background. What is the China threat within this country? For example, today I saw a headline that talked about 200 and some plus Chinese people showing up crossing the border in Mexico. You hear the FBI director talk about the number of counterintelligence cases that are being brought up every day on China. If you could offer some just quick thoughts on that Chinese threat from an internal U.S. perspective.
Yeah, I think the important thing to remember there, Larry, is that every one of these conflicts that General has so capably put out in front of us has a domestic aspect. And China is probably the biggest, most complicated, most challenging of those. And it's everything from what we know the Chinese are doing in cyberspace, the recent revelations about the targeting of our critical infrastructure. That's on top of the age-old issues we've had with economic espionage and the theft of our research and development information and what that's cheating out of our economy and our ability to be profitable and successful. So China is really an all-encompassing issue for the FBI, particularly for the counterintelligence division, but also for the cyber division. And I think that the recent reporting that we've gotten on the critical infrastructure positioning is really very different than what we've seen in the past from the Chinese, because this is essentially operational preparation of the battlefield. This is taking positions of advantage that can be used in the event that hostilities kick off between us. So that's very different from stealing your R&D or trying to crib the formula for white paint, all of things that the Chinese have done to us in the past. So there is that. On the other hand, we have our ongoing conflict, low-volume conflict with Russia, which has been exacerbated by our support, of course, to Ukraine, our essential support to Ukraine. We are rolling into an election season, and we know from our recent history that the Russians have, at least in the last decade, targeted our election process. It's something that I'm sure is foremost on the minds of our domestic officials. And then, on top of that, there's the broader issue, I think, right now about the potential of politically charged violence in this country as we go through the next year. We still remain a deeply divided nation politically, and the same sort of themes of grievance and mistrust and are weaving their way through the current political narrative. So I think our domestic law enforcement infrastructure's got to be kind of thinking about that in the backs of their mind, keeping large gatherings, groups of people, things like that, safe during what could be roiling times here.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. There's a lot to drill in on. So again, begin lining up. We've got a couple people lined up, and we'll get to your questions in just a moment. I thought I'd give at least David an opportunity to talk here.
Yeah, I need to jump in here because I know Andy McCabe. Andy McCabe is a friend of mine. But Andy McCabe is wrong. Not what you just said, that's all right. It's the socks. I mean, those are polka dot socks when stripes are clearly the way to go.
Can't we all just get along?
FBI, CIA, there's got to be something. So, hearing you talk about the elections, I mean, the real focus so far, just in the introductory comments, are on the election in the United States, which, of course, has worldwide impact. But this is really the year of elections. If you look at the elections worldwide, there's dozens and dozens of major elections in every area of the world. And it is a huge opportunity for adversaries of many countries to do a lot of bad things with misinformation, disinformation, and other things. And just in the first few weeks of this year, we've already seen the range here, right? You've seen Pakistan, which had an election which was marred with irregularities, potential vote rigging, violence before, during, and after the election. And on the other extreme, you see Finland, which had two presidential candidates who had very different and significant policy differences on primarily domestic issues. And yet, watching that election, you're like, can this really happen in the world? They had polite debates. They respected each other very clearly. They had the election without any of these issues and found a way to, actually get through this process with all the landmines that are being put in front of them. But that's only the beginning of this year. What are we, a few weeks in? We've got a whole lot coming in a lot of places. They're going to have challenges, frankly, more like Pakistan than like Finland. So 2024 has all the challenges that we've talked about, but it's in the context of all of these democracies in a time of challenge for democracies, getting people to the polls safely, getting people to the polls without overwhelming misinformation, disinformation, changing the outcome of the people's choice. And to have the challenges of Russia and Ukraine and all of the other issues on top of that is going to lead to a very complicated environment.
Well, this is a great table setting that we've done here. We do have folks lining up, so why don't we go over here to this side of the stage and please ask your question.
Good evening, Maurizio Geri. I'm an Italian scholar, visiting fellow here at GMU. And my question, picking on what the general said about China, 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 and then we have Russia and Iran now. What is the problem? Why we cannot see reality? Why is it difficult to foresight what are the real issues? I'm asking FBI, CIA, political scientists. I'm asking this because I come from Italy. There is someone here from Turkey. We speak often about migrations as a national security threat for the future. And then suddenly maybe something else will come, like space, etc. My question is, what are the cultural limits or institutional limits that we have to understand what are the future threats? Because we are in a moment in which we are in a disorder in the world, and it's very difficult to pick up at national security level an issue, because I'm also a reservist of Italian Navy. I'm a POLAD, political advisor. Many times they ask me what will be the next threat, and it's complicated to speak about this. So my question is really, what do you think, what are the limits to understand what is the real issue that is coming in the future? Thank you very much.
You want to go ahead?
Yeah, just a brief one. China will be the most important thing for 100 years, okay? So that's really important. But also now we're doing many things in the Middle East and in Europe as well. So I'm looking at, for people in the United States, CIA, for example. I don't know, it's hard, but it's very, very hard to see about China because in our culture, we don't know a lot about China, okay? And that's a real problem. Now, we were able to do it 50, 60 years ago for the Soviet Union. Okay? We did a lot of things, and we were really good at it because we had to be. The second thing, I think, the Middle East. Okay? It's hard, and it's a little bit strange for us. We have I'm sorry, the word is, we had the Middle East a lot, maybe 150 years, because they want to talk about government. And then the easiest one is in Europe. We know mostly we know all about that, okay? So I think it will be easy for that. But for the last one is China, and a lot of, were people, when I went to CIA and talked about, there were good people there, but not a lot of people, just a lot. And I think we have to do much more for that.
Any thoughts, Ellen, from
So I thought maybe you were asking a kind of intelligence methodology and its limits kind of question of sort of how does the profession of intelligence, why don't we get it right more often, or why do we fail to predict some bad things that will happen? There's a wonderful book by Dick Betts called Enemies of Intelligence, and his enemies are, there are adversaries that try to deceive us, that try to convince us that something's about to happen that isn't. I mean, Hamas just pulled off an extraordinary deception operation in some ways. So that's one enemy of intelligence. There's the kind of cognitive biases that people have. And then there's kind of institutional factors that are not intentionally trying to undermine intelligence performance, but they turn out to be unintentional impediments, whether it's bureaucratic constraints, et cetera. But there's two pieces of intelligence that, of the intelligence process in the US, and maybe it's relevant to your work in NATO and other places. Warning becomes a core function. And people who do warning don't run out of scary bad things to talk about. They can have a list of, this could happen, even if it's 10% probability and not 60% probability. So it's not that people lack the ability to game out dangerous bad things that could happen, but that's in tension with the expectation to the policymakers that you stay in the real world. You stay in the range of the most likely. That's the world they want to live in, where they have to move things forward on a day-to-day basis. So how do you manage both what I think in the intelligence business they say is low probability, high impact events? The Russian government turns even more aggressive and starts doing not just cruel things at home, but they start to do it beyond their borders. People could envision that as one of the scenarios that could happen, but when you're interacting with policy, you can't just stay at the level of warning of low probability events. You still have to adjust for what's most likely. And the last point I'd make on intelligence performance of why we sometimes get it wrong is I think regional analysts have to also have good generalists in the room tempering, because the regional analysts will generally think that things will remain as they are. They have a bias towards continuity. And I think sometimes, and I have my own experiences of the regional analysts didn't see that something that was truly disruptive was about to happen. The warning analyst got it right. So it's that tension within the art and science of intelligence that I think sometimes makes it look like, from the public's perspective, why didn't we know? The Gorbachev to Yeltsin, why didn't we know? Yeltsin to Putin, et cetera. We did know, we knew a lot, and you do your best to, explain the range of possible outcomes, but there are these tensions within the methodologies of intelligence, I think.
I'll add one thing to that. That makes me think that, our conversation so far and the answer to your question is about threats. What's going to happen next that's bad that we need to react to? Yeah. And that's part of the job. That's always going to be there. Sometimes we're good at it, sometimes we're not so good at it. Part of the job of the intelligence analyst, but I think also policy officials, is to explain to political leaders, here's what we think the immediate threat might be. Tomorrow, we're going to have to deal with this. Mm-hmm. But there's this trend, and we're going to have to deal with it. We have to deal with the effects of climate change, of China as a rising power, of all those issues. All that's true. But we can't lose sight of the need to identify opportunities, because in any change, it's not just a threat, there are also opportunities. And that's where policymakers sometimes need the reminder when they're in their 12th hour that day in a senior level meeting to address the immediate threat. It's like, well, let's spend a little bit of time setting up to find what we can use in this change to actually improve things in another area of policy. That's hard to do, but somebody has to remember to do it. Otherwise, you're just chasing the inbox constantly.
So I want to go ahead and take a question from our YouTube audience. And this shifts gears a bit and gets a little bit more tactical on some current events. So with regard to Ukraine and Russia, we have a debate going on within our national leadership and Congress about how much funding, what kind of equipment that we should or should not be providing to Ukraine. We have discussions, similar discussions happening in European capitals and other capitals around the world, with a growing concern that that collectively there may not be the will or the resources to provide the Ukrainians what they need to stem the tide of the Russian attack. So this question presumes that Russia ultimately succeeds. Would any of you want to take on the question of what does Russia then do next? Is Russia then going to continue to move forward? Are they going to try to then claim lands in Poland or lands in the Baltic or northern countries?
I want to challenge the premise of your question. You said that there is a debate going on in the US on this. There really is no debate. In the House of Representatives, it's not being put up for a vote. There's not a conversation. There's not a debate. I would like to see things put up for votes in our deliberative legislative bodies. Then we can talk about the level of funding. But right now, it's not even a possibility. So I don't like that. The scenario that you lay out is a dark one, and I don't think it's as likely as some others do. I do think that we will bounce back from this moment that feels dark. We forget when we talked about the immediate versus the trends. The trend line for Russia, even in the Ukraine conflict, is not good. This has been 2 years of immense losses, and we see the strains in society based on what we saw with Navalny recently. That is a reflection of the government struggling in other ways. So I'm not so sure about that. I do think that there is a huge difference between an invasion of Ukraine in 2022 and an invasion of a NATO country in 2024. And Putin may have a different calculus than we thought when it comes to the former, but the calculus is a very different one for everyone to see when it comes to NATO in 2024. So I would not see a move against NATO being as likely as some of the naysayers put out there. But the idea of adventurism abroad, I mean, what's happening with Russian dissidents in the last few years, even overseas, without strong reasons not to do so, I think that's an easy way to push the boundaries, to push the norms, and to take more actions of transnational repression, because that's not quite an invasion of NATO, but it certainly gets at some of Russia's enemies. That's almost certain to continue based on what we've seen so far.
General Hayden, in the past when discussing Russia, you have referred to Putin as playing poker, but he's playing a heck of a game with like a pair of sevens.
Yep.
Move forward now 2 years to where he is today. Do you still hold that view?
Yes, I do. Listen, if you look at all the economy, for example, it's not too good for Russia at all, okay? But again, he wants to do something. The military, even still for 2 years, it's very bad for the Russia, okay? So, but again, that's his only hope, okay? And he's trying to do it. What I think happened was they know Ukraine is going to the West. Everybody knows that. And so Putin said, I have to do something because if I don't do it now, it'll be gone. And that's what happened.
Why don't we go to our in-person audience? This gentleman's been very patiently waiting over here. Thank you.
Yeah, I had a great question in mind, and then everyone either answered it or everything about it. I'm going to assert that the U.S. has benefited from information development being on our side for most of history. That people power came about through information technology, but maybe now we've reached a limit where the environment is not so conducive for the critical infrastructure of our democracy or our way of life. Do you think that we've kind of reached a limit where there's now so much information that what was once healthy discourse is now trying to compete with not so healthy signals and bad intentions? And that's not just a question about like gray zone activities. It's more a question of like, have we lost our strategic footing as a democracy in a world that's just not so friendly to the way we conduct our business?
I could just, one thing I would say, the Enlightenment came and it was 300 years, okay? And people were saying now the Enlightenment is over. And that's a really bad thing for a lot of stuff, but in intelligence, it's really bad. It is really bad. And I think that's happening. That's exactly what's happening.
If anybody is interested, General Hayden wrote a second book called The Assault on Intelligence, which dives deeply into that subject matter and the assault on truth telling institutions like the university, science, intelligence, the law, et cetera. So.
Yeah, I mean, like, how about the courts,
Yeah.
right?
And the courts.
When we reach a point where people's belief in truth has been so eroded, then how do you stand in front of a jury and convince them beyond a reasonable doubt that someone has, committed offense? How do we think about what constitutes evidence? What constitutes unassailable evidence in a world where every photograph could be, computer generated? So I think we're in a super challenging time with our relationship to information and how we are dealing it, how we evaluate it. But at the same time, we continue to evolve, right? We are constantly on the verge of massive technological advancement. I think that it's, maybe I'm so rare that I would be the optimist in any group, but all right, I'm going to go in that direction. I think that we are on the verge of developing tools if we decide to deploy them in the right way, in pursuit of these purposes, to help us sort through what is fiction and determine what is fact, that we can't even imagine how tools like quantum computing and AI will be able to assist us in that effort. So yeah, huge challenges, big problems, and sometimes it gets hard to see kind of the forest for the trees. But I still think that we have immense capacity to engineer new solutions.
So Ellen, you lead an academic center that is training the future policymakers and future intelligence leaders of the world or the United States or the world. How are you looking at this problem of information?
So Stephen's question is completely, is quite meaningful to me in the sense that I remember George Tenet used to say, the problem is the volume of information that comes at us, okay? Now we've got both quantity and quality as problems, right? So there's too much of it, and you can develop filters and sensors and everything to try to pick out what's the most meaningful. But then you've got this question of, what's true, and how are we going to get smart enough, as Andy McCabe hopes we will, to use technology to do that filtering process in a way that benefits. But what I think you were alluding to is that our society, people absorb that what they think is correct information, and it changes their behavior, it changes their attitudes. And how do you unlearn that? Are you willing to sort of say, gee, maybe what I used to think that was based on information I got from one TV station or one social media site, how do I unlearn something if I'm at least open-minded enough to think maybe my sources of information are not reliable? So I worry that it's kind of an evolutionary problem. It's not just a technology fix. But I do think that graduate school is too late to learn how to be a smart information user. We've got to be doing this in elementary school, of getting kids to understand that checking your sources and making sure you know what kinds of information you're using. We have to build that into the education system, and we really need to be very purposeful about that, I think. But in the political environment in which we live, people cling to the information that they get from sources that they consider reliable, and it's very hard to unpack that, I think. So I'm a little more pessimistic than you. I don't always think there's a technological solution, because sometimes it's culture. Sometimes it's culture, it's psychology, it's many other ways in which flawed human beings behave.
I'll take the middle of the road between you here. On your last point, I'm skeptical because what I see is our kids in high school learning calculus, and I'm sure calculus is important for many important problems, but everybody needs critical thinking. And I'm not seeing a systematic, rigorous study of critical thinking, which means if it's not happening in our schools, it's up to us. Whether it's our own kids, whether it's our communities, we have to be teaching critical thinking skills when brains are forming, or else it's too late. So I'm pessimistic because I'm not seeing that yet, but I want to see that happen. I'm optimistic in one way. which is a comparison to the past. So you mentioned, things are getting worse in the information environment. There's more information and more bad information gets out. Also, more good information gets out to counter the bad information. So in 1800, there was a significant percentage of the American people who thought that one of the candidates for president, Thomas Jefferson, was doing live sacrifices on an altar at his home in Virginia. That was put out there in the press.
He wasn't?
Well, the historians have not yet found evidence of it. They can't back that up. And yet, we've been able to survive and even thrive as a nation for 200 years since then. And there was not a lot of good opportunities for good information to counter that misinformation. Now, there are many ways to do it, even without the technology advances. There's just more good information as well as bad information. So I'm slightly more optimistic on that front that we can get there.
So I'll take another question from our YouTube audience, and this one looks at China. I'll read the question, and then I'm going to maybe elevate it a little bit. With China's potential attempt to reclaim Taiwan and recent disclosures regarding Volt Typhoon and Chinese footholds in critical U.S. infrastructure that Andy was mentioning earlier, what potential U.S. response could be effective? I guess I would elevate that a notch above that and maybe ask you all to address China as a threat, perhaps compared to what we saw in our earlier careers as the threat from the Soviet Union. How does it compare? How does it contrast? And at kind of that higher level, what would your recommendation be as a broad policy with regard to how to deal with these threats from China? Maybe we start with you, Ellen.
So in the Cold War, we thought the threat, we did think about whether the threat from the Soviet Union was primarily military or ideological, and we developed both intelligence and policy techniques to monitor very closely both of those things. We developed huge intelligence infrastructure to count how many tanks they had and fighter bombers, et cetera. So it was a material problem as well as a sort of political and philosophical problem of, how do you thwart the appeal of communism in post-war Europe? So you had to be operating on multiple levels. The China problem, to me, is even more complex. You can't reduce it to sort of two planes. It's more than two planes, in part because of their power in the international economy, their advanced use of technology to go beyond, when you think of state-to-state competition or that could veer into conflict, you think you've contained it into the sort of the attributes of national power that are relevant. So you look at the military, you look at the economy, et cetera. The Chinese can operate on multiple levels because of their clever use of surveillance techniques and penetration of the economic infrastructure, because we're so permissive in letting people start companies in this country, et cetera. So they are gaining information about us and learning our, perhaps reverse engineering some of our economic strengths because they've been able to penetrate different levels of American, society and system. So I think in the 21st century, we have to think of the attributes of national power. It's an even richer hierarchy of tools that governments have than the Cold War period now almost seems quaint and simple by comparison, in my view. Yeah.
Andy?
I think that's right. I mean, if you think about it, and not to diminish the significance of the Russian threat during the Cold War, but we weren't inextricably linked to Russia's economy. Right? They weren't our biggest trading partner. Russia didn't hold a massive amount of U.S. debt. Right? So there's all these other kind of economic and other intangibles that make this incredibly complicated. And if you look at China through the same lens that we kind of applied to Russia, they're arguably a more significant threat, right? They have the same sort of, or similar capabilities in terms of weapons of mass destruction. They've got an enormous military. They are, completely in command of every significant business in China. So it's Yeah, it's like 5-dimensional versus
Yeah.
2-dimensional. And I also think, getting back to one of the earlier questions tonight, you asked about the challenges in seeing the next threat, seeing the next issue. To me, as an agency leader, one of the biggest day-to-day challenges is something I used to refer to as the tyranny of the urgent. You have to look at the fire that's burning right in front of you first, right? And that's where you develop this, this muscle memory of responding to crisis, which you have to do. That's kind of first on your list. But day in, day out of that, you start to really neglect the broader strategic threats that are out there. That's what stopped me from looking at the bigger, longer-term projects that I should have been focusing on in some of my final positions. And China is that kind of threat to the United States. Like the General said, that's a 100-year problem. They are bigger, faster, stronger, more strategic than really any other nation that we currently consider adversaries. And that requires a lot of really considered, consistent thinking. And, you know, the war in the Middle East or the war in Ukraine are taking us away from that focus.
I'll point out China also suffers from a massive economic problem that is just starting, massive demographic problems, massive susceptibility to climate change, and all those things make it more dangerous, not less, in the coming years as they come to grips with that. The other element in terms of a lesson from the Cold War to now that we haven't mentioned yet is alliances. Is the United States succeeded in the Cold War in part because of a network of alliances that remained steadfast against the most salient parts of the Russian and Soviet threat. And we have a similar, although different in many ways, but a similar set of alliances that are concerned about the Chinese threat. The difference is there's a lot more talk now about the necessity of those alliances in different contexts. So US policymakers really need to keep that lesson in mind, that the United States can't do this alone, and to the extent there is a major threat from a power like China, you do a whole lot better if you have countries ranging from Japan to Western Europe that see the threat similarly.
All right, let's go to another audience, in-person audience question. Thank you.
Thank you, Reddy, for pointing me. I'm Joshua Park, a South Korean Navy captain retired and visiting scholar at Schar School. First of all, thank you for this wonderful open forum, especially thank you for General Hayden. Thank you, sir. Thank you. This is my question to direct at Dr. David Priess about election. This is the year of election year. Then first election happened the January 13th Taiwan's election. Then my question is more technical and intelligence-oriented question. What kinds of information operation Beijing did for impacting on this Taiwanese president election this year? Almost every election, Beijing tried to impact on, to do something. But this year election very important because it's a presidential election of Taiwan. Yep. Then could you sense any different features of Beijing's information operation on Taiwan's election? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good question. It's the easiest answer of the night for me now. It would have been the hardest for me decades ago before I learned the lesson that when you don't know, you answer, I don't know. I have not watched the China election closely enough to offer anything that would be useful. I will tell you, many people have in the United States government. There are people who are looking at exactly that question and analyzing it for policymakers. They're not on stage right now, and I'm not the person to answer that question. So if anyone else has thoughts on the Taiwan election, please chime in, or else we'll turn it to people in the audience and go one by one until someone.
Ellen, any thoughts?
Well, just in general, my impression is that the outcome was, in theory, not what the Chinese wanted, but the way they reacted demonstrated that the more pro-independence party in Taiwan managed their own position well. They did it in a way that was not triggering a stronger reaction by the Chinese. We also had it in the context of a slight warming of U.S.-China relations in advance. So it turned out to be kind of a non-event from a perspective of would it be causing greater tensions in the Asia-Pacific region, and I think it did not. On the technical questions of was there any interference, I also don't know the answer to that.
Okay. Let's go over here.
Hi, first of all, thank you so much for your time and your answers so far. I'm Stephen Towers. I'm a second-year master's student in the biodefense program here. What I research is emerging neurotechnologies across different contexts, so the warfighter, the intelligence community, and in the civilian context. Do you guys have any strong impressions about where those sort of use cases are happening in a national security threat scenario, especially given great power competition in that industry with China? And if not, I'll open it up a little broad. I know neuroscience is a little niche. Do you have any strong impressions about biotechnology as a whole, whether that's biosecurity or any sort of designer pathogen, et cetera? Thank you.
Anybody?
I don't have technical expertise on it, but I put that in the category of, we predict the things that are going to happen tomorrow, right? We will continue to struggle with the war in the Middle East. Got it. We know the trends, China, climate change, issues like that. Got it. But the things that will happen in 2024 that probably demand the most attention at a particular time are things that we haven't thought of yet that are outsized effects for the ability of somebody to do harm, and I think biotechnology is one of the biggest ones. My concern is not that we don't have smart people in the agencies that we used to represent that are watching these things. I think there are, and hopefully there are plenty of people in programs like this one who are preparing to do so. It's that policymakers don't have the time and attention to be prepared for it until it happens, and then suddenly they have to have a crash course in the matter of a 1-hour briefing while they're figuring out the response to understand the very concepts behind the attack. And there are a number of these. It's not just biotechnology. It can be any advanced technology that generalists aren't used to. So that's where I would take it on a general point is I don't know the specific technical issues involved, but I really want senior policymakers to be able to understand it when it does happen, because it's going to happen.
And
Just
or General Hayden?
Yeah, just so when I was at CIA, one or two things would happen, and they said you have to do that, and there's a lot going on. You don't know about that. I'm going to tell you about this. Okay? There are really good people at CIA. All right, and many times I would say for an hour. Okay. Okay, let's try it again one more time so I could do it. And then I'd go and talk to the president, So we have a lot of people in the military and at CIA that do many of these things. Yeah.
I would add that although we have some really smart technical people inside the intelligence community, that in some of these more esoteric areas like neuroscience or biotechnology, it's absolutely vital that the U.S. intel community and that the policy community is engaging with the academic community and the scientific community,
exactly.
Because that's where the expertise is and does lie, and that's where the reliance needs to be placed.
Yeah, I mean, for the record, I got confused when he said calculus before, so I don't know if neuroscience is going to be my thing. But even in my own experience, I saw that probably most recently in the response to the accusations about U.S. diplomatic folks serving overseas being subjected to unidentifiable attacks, right, and experiencing all these clearly bad health effects from which, in my time, we were not able to directly attribute. But that's exactly the scope of where you see the best of what we do have reaching out to folks in the private sector, across in other agencies, across the intel community, to try to kind of get to the bottom of a mystery like that. So it is something that a lot of time and energy is spent on, even when they fail to illuminate people like me.
But, and I would also underscore, for those of you who are still in at the university, at the undergrad or graduate level, even if you're primarily a liberal arts major like most of us on stage probably were, find some time to fold in technology and technological issues in your studies so that you are at least conversant and can begin to have those conversations, because there's an array of technological issues that are going to have serious implications in national security across the rest of this century. And I think the most successful intel analysts and policymakers are going to be those who begin with at least some knowledge in those areas. All right, let's go over here.
Yeah, I have a question for everyone on the report this week or last week that Russia put a nuclear weapon into space, and then in the backdrop of Secretary Blinken going and asking his counterparts in India and in China to help with that. And for Andy, this is in the form of a calculus question, so.
My understanding is, at least the information I've heard, is that the nuclear threat is not active, that it's a intention for future deployment of a nuclear device in space. It's still a bad thing, right? We have treaties to try to prevent this kind of thing from happening. So it's a concerning development. I think it's unfortunate that it came out the way it did, because there were people meeting about it, having discussions of it in a way that's harder when it can't be fully discussed publicly yet, and hopefully more will become public, because I think a public debate is part of it. What I'm hoping is that, unfortunate or not, the very fact that it's been publicly discussed and there have been a number of reactions, not only from the US government but others, that the Russian intentions change. I mean, you can change intentions by revealing intelligence information inadvertently or not. And the fact that it has not been deployed is actually a good thing, and maybe it won't be.
Any other thoughts? No? All right, let's go over here.
Oddly enough, very related.
You're going into space with a nuclear weapon, aren't you?
I am absolutely going to do that. And this is probably going to be a bit of an eye roll and maybe just a different style of the same question, which is, 12 years ago, the Republican standard bearer was calling Russia our biggest threat, and Mitt Romney during the 2012 election. And in the last few years, we've seen a massive shift in the way that the GOP talks about Russia, almost as an unusual potential ally or some kind of an aspiration. Could this action by Mike Turner last week in releasing the information have been maybe a come to Jesus from Republican leadership for people who are in the kind of the chaos caucus side of things and blocking a lot of this Ukraine aid? And with regard to Russia sending potentially an active nuclear threat into space, what does a space race like that look like for the intelligence community going forward?
I think it's difficult to divine exactly why Representative Turner disclosed the information. I mean, there's some speculation he did it to try to drive votes towards supporting Ukrainian aid. There are some who have speculated that it was an attempt to buttress moves to renew FISA 702 powers. But when Turner himself is asked, he describes it as an honest effort on his part to create a public debate about what he saw as a very serious threat. I think we could probably sit here and debate all day long, where that comes from. But I don't know if anybody else has any thoughts.
I think the important thing to take away from that is, despite what the politicians are doing for whatever reason they may have, I doubt that the experts in the intelligence community have any sort of divided opinion about it, right? So we have, and I'm sure all of us know, many people who spend their entire lives focused on subjects exactly like that, like whether or not the Russians are likely to back away from a further development, to stay in line with existing treaties, or what their exact technical capability is at any given moment. So it's frustrating for us because you get a little glimmer through this political theater, whatever it was. But it's also easier for those of us who've been in the community to trust that the people who actually need to know the answers to these questions are operating on much better information.
And we're hopeful that the disclosure didn't create the condition for the intelligence stream that helps define this problem, that it didn't go away.
That's right.
Because sources and methods were compromised.
Yep.
So kind of two thoughts. One is that it is a little mini case study in how the two branches, the executive branch and Congress, interact over intelligence matters, and that some members of Congress live in perpetual frustration that they're not given greater access, right? So there's a protocol to give a sort of inner circle of folks on the Hill, virtually full access, but other members of Congress, kind of pound the table and say, why can't I see the good stuff, that's coming in? So, that is part of it. But it was also frustrating for the Intel community because they said we were going to give them a classified briefing the next day, so that it was a little bit of a breakdown in the sort of accepted rules of how the two branches interact. But I wanted to just connect the dot to Bill Burns's remarkable role in revealing intelligence about Russia's intentions at, way back in, early 2022 and 23 and even earlier, so that people may assume that there's now a kind of new expectation that if we want to really get the Russians' attention and we want to change their behavior, we just talk about the intel we have in public. And I do think we're at an interesting moment of whether that gets normalized as a new way that intel and policy interact, or whether they're trying to, let Putin rethink whether invading Ukraine was such a great idea, whether that was a one-off experience and that was an exceptional revealing of intelligence. But it's possible that some members of Congress think that's been, now accepted behavior. So I don't know if others would, disagree with that, but this interbranch dynamic is also worth thinking about.
All right, over here.
Hi, my name is Lauren, and I am a master's in public administration student here at Schar. And my question, with regard to intelligence, what is and can be done so that another January 6th event never happens?
Yeah, I'm worried about that.
We know.
Think twice before
We've got a guy who does a podcast focused on that. Maybe he can answer if you.
I guess the answer is think twice before you encourage your students to come to the event on domestic terrorism night. So, good question, Lauren. We've just spent a lot of time talking about this tonight. I have some strong opinions, as I'm a private citizen and I don't know anything anymore, which is great. But I have some strong opinions about how little we know about what led to the intelligence failure on January 6th, which I feel like by any definition was clearly an intelligence failure. And speaking, predominantly about my former institution, whose number one priority is to prevent an act of terrorism in the United States. Well, an act of terrorism clearly occurred in the United States, an act of domestic terrorism. So on that grounds alone, this is an intelligence failure. We have in the past, the Bureau has in the past, after responding to incidents, particularly terrorist attacks or attempted terrorist attacks, gone to great lengths to conduct internal kind of after-action reviews. Sometimes we bring in distinguished people from outside the organization to oversee those reviews, like our investigation of how our performance led to or may have contributed to the terrorist attack at Fort Hood many years ago. We brought in former FBI Director William Webster to oversee that review, and we've done it with other folks in different contexts. What the question I have is, what has the Bureau done to reevaluate their own performance in the run-up to January 6th? We know that their initial impressions, their initial statements in the immediate aftermath of January 6th were not accurate in terms of their statements that they didn't have any information or informant information or any significant intelligence about what was planned. We know that now because much has been revealed through the course of many prosecutions of January 6th defendants. And information turned over in discovery to those defendants is uncovered there were several FBI informants who were questioned by their handlers in the run-up to January 6th, some of whom actually participated or were there for the events. So I think there are really good questions that they need to ask about how they could have performed differently to have had a better effect in preventing that attack. What concerns me is we haven't heard anything about that. We don't know if they've done an internal review. They haven't shared it with the public. There's been very little call for the FBI to do anything publicly and release the results of that work to Congress and to the United States people to the greatest extent that they can, which is kind of strange to me. But I know there is a Department of Justice IG investigation supposedly looking into that, but those things go on for many, many years and are unlikely, I think, to come up with a sort of really raw analysis that would be helpful in this situation. But yeah, so I don't know what they could have done differently or better. But I know that if I was there now, if I was still a senior official in the FBI, I'd be really, really worried, because the purpose of these reviews is not to hang someone out to dry or walk someone out of the building. Right. The purpose is to figure out how you can do the job better in the future and prevent the next one. And until those questions are answered, I don't know that you could really sleep comfortably.
All right.
Hey, howdy. My name is Zach. I'm a first semester student here at the Schar School with an MA in Global Commerce and Policy. But my research focus and interest is illicit networks and organized crime, specifically in Latin America. And my question is in relation to the national security issue of the migration crisis on our southern border, or trade security with our Latin American trade partners, or violence related to organized crime. How do we combat competitors destabilizing our allies in the Latin American region? What unique challenges do our intelligence and policy apparatus face with aiding our allies against an entity, such as China, who continues to grow their influence in this hemisphere with a negative effect on short-term and long-term regional security?
That's a big question. I know some of the professors in the school are addressing those issues themselves. Is there anything you've gleaned from your conversations with those?
Well, I think the way you framed the question is a very holistic approach when you think about it, that we can break it down to the immediate acute problems. As others have said, sometimes policymakers will just be focused entirely on how many people are crossing the border in one part of Texas. But you already understood that you have to go back to the countries of origin and what are their development challenges? Why are there sources of political instability there? So it's a whole of government enterprise where we're not just looking at the outcome of the problem, but the sources of the problem itself. And unfortunately, I think the United States has worked for decades with some of the vulnerable, the small countries of Central America, with the Mexicans, and it's sometimes a very fraught relationship because of this asymmetry where the United States is both a huge destination for economic migrants, for political asylees, but it's a market for illicit goods. So we are both part of the problem and we want to be part of the solution. So I think you have good work cut out for you in your studies here, because it's a complex web of interactions. I don't think it's purely an intel problem. I think it's an economic development challenge as well as a major diplomatic and political challenge for the United States.
Easy problems don't get solved automatically. That's true. But this is a really, really hard problem. It's been decades in the making. It has to do with political instability. It has to do with a whole lot of issues having to do with U.S. foreign aid, with allied actions. There's a whole range of issues, economic, political, and social. Mm-hmm. And yet, this is the easy one compared to what's coming. Because if we can't get our hands around issues of migration and immigration and borders when it comes to political instability in Central America primarily, and South America as well, what are we going to do in most of your lifetimes, in a few decades, when there's literally hundreds of millions of climate refugees, not in the world, but from one country, Bangladesh, and then hundreds of millions from neighboring countries, and actually probably billions total. If we can't learn now how to deal with these issues and talk about them like adults, we're going to have a much bigger problem that affects every society and fundamentally rips apart the fabric of democracy as we know it. So we'd better get around this fast. We'd better figure out how to have a reasonable immigration system and legislate a more rational system for immigration in this country so that we can face the much, much bigger challenge that's coming soon after.
Right, question over here.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Dorian Montiano. I'm the co-founder of the Intelligent Automation Initiative here at Schar School of Policy and Government. First of all, thanks everyone for your service here. Second, my question is related to a race that I believe it's going on in this world, and I'm not sure if you agree or disagree. It's about the race between fear and trust. If we believe that trust is the most important currency in a democracy, I'm curious, what are your thoughts about the role that these emerging technologies, AI, automation, and everything in between, plays in this race between fear and trust, and how it can improve trust and diminish fear? Thank you.
General, do you have any thoughts?
Oh, for me, right, okay. So I've done a lot of thinking about this. You know, I read a lot, okay? And it's a real question for everybody. So what are we going to do about it? And I think, like I said, I read a lot of books about that. And you can see people were saying on one side, it'll be okay. It'll be hard, but it'll be okay. And over here, I'm worried about that. What's going on in, you know, everything is complicated, and I just can't, I just can't do it, you know? So what are we going to do? And what I think about that, I think we've done that before. Really, we've done that before. And I think it'll be okay. I'm worried about that, but I think it'll be okay. It'll be hard, okay? And for the United States, we'll do this and this and this. And our friends in Europe, not so much. We're going to do this and this and this. And then the other, in China and the Middle East and Russia, they have a different thing altogether, you know? So it's a real problem. But again, a lot of people are thinking about this, okay? So I think I'm going to try to say, sooner or later, it'll be better. It'll be better. But again, it's very hard. Look, I'm old, all right? You know, I'm going to be dead before the things come out, you know? And I'm worried about my grandkids. What are they doing to do about that? But I think it'll be okay. But we'll see. We'll see.
We also tend to focus on this issue, and rightfully, we tend to focus on the trust issue as, look at all the things that we can't trust now, right? Like deepfakes, and like you said, are you ever going to be able to take a photograph into a court of law in a few years? That's all true, but think about the technology that helps us trust things now. I'm old enough to remember going to websites where you typed in the web page and you didn't authenticate. There was no way to prove identity. I mean, look, what do you do on your phone, right? You use a fingerprint or an eye scan and suddenly, or face scan, and there's authentication. There are technologies to help with trust at the same time that there are elements undermining trust. So I don't think it's fear versus trust solely. I think it's also that constant balance of how are you increasing trust versus decreasing trust using technology. And I want people focused on that because that's what motivates people to go and work in these areas. You know, get some smart engineers working, not to disrupt the trust network, but actually to increase it through some of these technologies.
Well, these have been all fantastic questions. I apologize to the, well, actually, we just got one gentleman left. Why don't we take one more question? All right.
I'll try to make this one fun, sort of. Adam Tabika, Schar School alum. So there's a lot of election year, election eve or election year events that could tip the election one way or the other. 2004, Bin Laden tapes. 2008, Great Recession. 2012, Superstorm Sandy. 2016, Comey. 2020, COVID. What are your predictions, possibilities for 2024?
Not Comey.
I've got a call. I got to go.
I guess I would say that each one of those cycles brought a surprise that none of us were expecting. I'm guessing between now and November, there'll be some surprises that
What could happen?
most of us aren't. What's that?
What could possibly happen?
Live sacrifices on altars.
It's going to be an interesting several months until that election. I think we're going to see some, well, I think most sensible people agree that Russia has historically, and in particular in recent elections, interfered in the elections and trying to influence our elections in several directions. Other countries have learned from that. We now have China actively working against elections. We have Iran working against elections. By the way, I'm surprised we haven't talked at all about Iran tonight, but Iran working against election and others. So I think we're going to see a growth in election interference. The technology with the deep fakes, with artificial intelligence, with misinformation, I think we're going to have an electorate that's already distrustful become even more distrustful.
For me, I'm worried about that as well. So I think for me, okay, the Chinese are doing something, the Russians are doing something, and so on. But that's not the point. The point is us, okay? The point is us. And if we do the wrong thing, and then I worry about democracy going forward. I really worry about that now.
My only prediction is that it won't involve Jim Comey. That's my hope for Jim and the election.
How is Jim?
He's doing fine. I'm with you, General. My concern is more for how people will conduct themselves in and around the election.
Yes.
Will they go? Is a level of kind of frustration and disgust with all things political so high that it'll discourage people from going? If they go, will they trust the result? Will they listen to the evidence? Will they listen to the people who are responsible for maintaining this security and the stability of our election? Listen to them rather than listening to other people who don't know what they're talking about? Will our politicians stand up for this noble, amazing experiment that we conduct every 4 years, rather than trying to undermine it for their own political purposes? Will the candidates accept the result? And so I think the answers to any of those questions are unclear at this point.
But it's us.
But at the end of the day, it's we're gonna decide how it goes. Us and our 300 million fellow citizens.
I was going to also go in a slightly more sober direction, and I quite agree that it's us, but let's say that either or both of these wars that the U.S. is trying to stay out of really hits, gets to some new catastrophic phase, and the incumbent administration has to make some very hard decisions about American responses, which could then tip the election results in the direction of greater American withdrawal from the world. So I do worry about whether the mood is already moving us in the direction of less engagement. And those of us who've been part of the intel and national security world, you know, for us, our core assumptions about America's role in the world could be at risk.
Yes.
On that happy note.
Yeah.
Well, we've run a little long, and that was because we had a lot of great questions. I've got a sheet of paper here with all kinds of topics that I listed in case we didn't get as many questions. You've instilled great faith in me that about the program we offer here. We touched on just about everything. So thank you all for your questions, both here in person and on YouTube. I'd like to thank our panel for the willingness to sit on stage and just take random questions out of nowhere, you know, without having a lot of time to prepare ahead of time on a specific topic. So thank you, David. Thank you, Andy. Thank you, General Hayden, for this and everything else you do for us, and Ellen as well. So a round of applause for our guests. For those of you here in person, we've got some great food and drinks waiting over there. For those of you online, you're jealous, I know. Come next time, you can get some food.